We are live now. We are live now, and
Okay.
yes, we are live now. Welcome to all of you for today's very interesting talk on a very interesting topic. We are all fond of lauding or constitution, looking at it, and talk about the various values in the constitution. But there is so much. Even today, we don't know much about the process. Even though we have the constitution, constitutional assembly debates with us, and also the history of the constitution written by a lot of people. But a very interesting perspective about how Baba Sahib Ambedkar has, we know that he single-handedly piloted the constitution, but there are some things which were not in the public domain for a long time, and a scholar like Akash Singh Rathore has brought his expertise in lot of domains like history, law, and philosophy, religious studies to bear upon understanding the kind of role played by Baba Sahib Ambedkar, particularly in terms of the various aspects of our constitution. And he has written a book, which is a wonderful book. I got it second day only when it was published, and it has been very well written book, and it's titled as Ambedkar's Preamble: A Secret History of the Constitution of India. Now, Akash brother's interest in Ambedkar is very long. He has first published long time a critical edition of the Buddha and his Dhamma, and then he has been now working on a 5-volume box set, Bia Ambedkar: The Quest for Justice, which will be out this year. And also he's working on a very definitive biography of Baba Sahib Ambedkar, which will be published maybe next year by Macmillan. He has also published Dalit Feminist Theory, Reader, and also he has written on various aspects. He has written on various aspects of not only Baba Sahib Ambedkar, but also law, jurisprudence, so on and so forth. So I'm not going to take much of your time, but I'm going to only say that in today's today we when we are looking at our country, these 4 values, actually 6 values, with Akash Bhai has talked in his book, justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity, as the dignity and nation. These 6 values are so important for our country today to really understand. What do they stand for? How we can bring them into our day-to-day life? How we can bring them all in our national life, and so on and so forth. So, without taking much time, I would like to request uh, Akash Bhai to please begin his presentation. Akash Bhai.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to virtual chat with you and the Facebook audience. I've been a fan of Ambedkar Caravan for a long time. Absolute miracle worker. You and I assume you have some helpers, assistants, partners. It's a wonderful resource that I find myself checking all the time. So I'm going to talk about this book, but I also want to discuss the context of the book, not simply because of what the COVID-19 coronavirus situation has, the situation that has resulted from that, but while it might be somewhat unpopular for me to say this, I think what we are witnessing in front of our eyes in the COVID-19 scenario in India is not causal by any stretch of the imagination. It is merely a logical consequence of what has been unfolding for several years now, and that is the slow collapse of the egalitarian welfare state. So, considering how government is responding right now, and the differential way that social classes get in this country. And so I want to talk about this erosion of the welfare state in relationship to the Constitution and the preamble. Now, before lockdown, I was giving a talk at Delhi Tech Institute, like an IIT, and I was on the preamble. And someone in the audience, not just anyone, a professor of a prestigious tech university, well-educated person, at least in technology and science, interrupted me to ask, what is so sacred about the Constitution anyway? So she was annoyed by my veneration of values like equality, fraternity, and dignity. So she asks, what's so sacred about the Constitution? Now, we're accustomed to hearing this from anarchists who are not interested in the state because of its nefarious tendencies. We're accustomed to this from radical leftists who are opposed to the state as a bourgeois structure and so on. But what's interesting is that this was not an anarchist, not a radical leftist. This was a... Now, how do we understand this transformation that is happening now by someone who I'm sure was banging bartans on the balcony when asked, and yet at the same time will ask a speaker like me, what's so sacred about our Constitution? So what we're seeing now is what there's this expression, sea change, a kind of change that happens because of the circumstantial environmental changes. And as I'm sure all of you know, the way that global capitalism has slowly eroded the financial viability of the welfare state, states themselves, highly militarized states like India, the United States, and others, states like these have been since the 21st century, since 2000, 2001, advocating the priority of security over liberty. This is the security paradigm. So already in this attempt to balance liberty because of the need of security that takes the form of terrorism or whatever bogey gets created by the state, the idea, fundamental constitutional idea of liberty gets set somewhat to the side. At the same time, issues something like privacy gets slowly eroded through surveillance, through biometrics, through basically all of the things that this French philosopher Foucault had called governmentality. This is when administrative efficiency takes a priority. So executive efficiency, executive, administrative, bureaucratic efficiency takes a priority over fundamental rights like privacy. So it's a nice song, but I wonder if it can be turned down.
What I fucking hate. Nigger.
Bhai, please go on. Somebody,
Okay.
Yeah, please go on. Sorry about this.
So, yeah, that's fine. So what we're seeing in this so-called sea change is that many factors at the same time, global capitalism, security concerns, administrative efficiency, each of these is eating away at the basic notion of the egalitarian welfare state. All of these degrade the fundamental principles of the Constitution. And in this process, authority, executive authority, wants to be liberated from the burdens of substantive welfare. So an executive, the executive of the state seems to need this kind of flexibility to respond and react in ways that promote its own viability, but in the process have to degrade basic features of our liberty, equality, and of course, privacy, and all in all welfare. So this has been happening for decades now. This has been building for decades now. So if we see in a COVID-19 situation that all of this has flared up into the forefront, it doesn't mean that COVID-19 is the cause. It is an effect of this process. Now, why am I talking about this? Because essentially, when someone asks the question, what is so sacred about the Constitution? God damn. In a way, what...
And listen to you goofy niggas anymore. You ugly, man. You fucking ugly. I'm sorry, carry on.
I don't know. I didn't share a link with anybody, but people are trying to come in the room. Anyway, Akash bhai.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. It's all right.
Yeah.
I won't admit anybody in the room now because people are trying to come in our Zoom room. The link is only shared between us. Anyway, please go on. I
see. We're being hacked.
No. I don't know, but I think let's go. Nothing will happen now. I won't let anybody in.
Okay. So shall I start again?
Yes. Please.
Okay. So basically what I'm trying to warm up to the idea that when we speak of the Constitution, the contemporary challenges that are coming to the authority, the so-called secular sanctity of the Constitution, are now not from the places where we traditionally end in a radical left or scenario, but it's coming from the right. And this is quite odd. There has always been in support strong and authoritarian states, and the state, of course, basic legitimacy from the Constitution itself. So what is happening right now is that when people are asking, why is the Constitution so sacred, especially from the leaning ideology, what they're really saying is, why should the executive be bound by egalitarian justice? Why should we limit the powers of the executive because of something as lesser in their conception as egalitarian justice? So what we find today is essentially a throwback to prior to the 17th century, when we took it as natural that the executive would have no constraints in his authority, in his power, in his sovereignty. And popular legitimacy wasn't necessarily the source, but instead it was something like natural right or some theological approval. And since we find theology as a justification for executive power in the medieval world, we're finding it in today in the contemporary world as a way of eroding constitutional values like liberty, equality, justice, and substituting them by a re-emerging executive authoritarianism caused by many factors, not just by ideology, but probably fundamentally because of capitalism. But that's not something that we can do much at this moment. Now, why this coming up is because you may have noticed in the last 15 to 18 months, so many books on the Constitution coming out. So many books are appearing also from popular presses, as opposed to from the legal presses. So I have put here Bhatia's Transitive Constitution. This is one by HarperCollins. There's another one by Chintan Chandrachud, the cases that India Brothers by Jagannath. Again, these are trade market publishers, and that's why I'm pointing the issue out. It's a very big difference when we produce works on the Constitution for a popular audience versus when we produce them for an academic one. HarperCollins, well, this is Harvard University Press, but it's come out in a trade paperback for the Indian market. Khosrau's Indian is founding moment, and Penguin's Stormy Days. So HarperCollins and so on. Why are we watching so many books coming out about the Constitution? Because of this sea change, because people are starting to wonder about the sanctity of the Constitution, the relationship, the balance between executive authority, which the nature of the current nation state wants to unleash, and such events as COVID-19 are a perfect opportunity, versus the rights and the welfare system guaranteed by the Constitution itself. So just for a moment about what some of these books do, and especially I want to focus on 16 Stormy Days for two reasons. One, that it's a #1 best-selling book in India. And number two, that is so profoundly dangerous that we need, and while the newspapers and the media give it so much publicity, talking about its different aspects of what it reveals about the First Amendment to the Constitution, what they find is how it cooperates with this current desire, this current change in Indian social life, unleashing the executive power. So this book, what this does essentially is a character assassination of Nehru. So most of the books that I had shown come down either on the side of pro-Nehru books, or like this book of Singh's, anti-Nehru books, or Nehru is somewhat relevant to the books, my own. Ambedkar's preamble here, Nehru plays no significant part. So in this, what anti-Nehruvian book in the year 2020, and why should it become a bestseller? Why should a book that I characterize, in fact, as the genre of revenge porn, where Nehru is so graphically humiliated and assassinated by the author, clear delight of rightward wing gaze. So you want this kind of assassination to happen, so the right wing can rush in this graphic murder of Nehru. This is what is unfolding in this book in a quite implicit but insidious way. What it functions to do in Tripadaram Singh's thesis is that Nehru is basically an authoritarian dictator who introduced the First Amendment because he was an authoritarian and he wanted to have his way and he wanted to oppress freedom of speech and so on. What this suggests is that despite how, as scholars, activists today want to believe that we can make progress through solidarity, we can wrestle justice from the state, what this book is attempting to establish is that India was doomed from the very beginning. From 1950 to 1951, the game is lost because the First Amendment already introduced retrograde erosions of our fundamental liberties, speech, and libertarian equality. In other words, sort of perceived egalitarianism based on pure merit. So we can call this a kind of dominical liberty. So the book seems to claim that all executives are dictators, and Nehru was a dictator. And since then, the state is always leaning towards dictatorship. And so why claim about the current dictatorial regime? What is the nature of state? So live. And this is a kind of cynical scholarship that is starting to come out from the right wing. I think Singh is a libertarian, not necessarily right wing, but this is a rightward leaning libertarian because has no concern social welfare. Yeah.
Do you have internet connection which is on Wi-Fi or
on Wi-Fi? Is it?
If you can turn the Wi-Fi, then it will be great.
Yeah, it is on Wi-Fi, but my Wi-Fi is not doing well. Let me.
Okay. No problem. Please go on.
Okay. So this is just what one thing that we need to pay attention to is the way that the contemporary ideological change that is slowly taking over the middle classes, as opposed to the to just the revolutionary anarchic fringe groups, the conservative middle classes beginning to question the validity of the Constitution on the basis of wishing for the executive to be unbound, because that is just the nature, according to this idea of so what this basic sea change, what we're seeing in these new trade books on the Constitution, we're seeing some beginning the idea, the classical idea of welfare state that is established in the structure of the Indian Constitution versus liberating that. We can see each of these books that I had shown you the photo of, that these are in some way being argued about in each one. So the fundamental question becomes, how do we convince the libertarian that that political liberty is in no way equivalent to social emancipation? Because we all know, anyone I think would all be familiar with Dr. Ambedkar's work. Anyone who is familiar with his work understands that he drew a sharp line between political liberty and emancipation, or political justice versus social justice. He spoke no fewer than 3 great speeches, 2 in the Constituent Assembly, 1 in the Rajya Sabha, about this life of contradictions between political liberty and justice. What we see then is that we need to uncover that what is the nature of the Constitution from the beginning is that social revolution is coded in to the nature of political liberty in the Constitution. It's not as largely presented in the West, that first you have a first gen rights that are called blue rights, political rights, and then you can have next generation of rights that come later, because they're not justiciable, like red rights or social rights, blue rights, cultural rights, and then you have green rights, that these go one after the other. Not that the Constitution was designed in the mind of Dr. Ambedkar. Instead, the social revolution gets packed in, coded into the very nature of the political revolution. And what Ambedkar did was that he wrote this into the preamble. The preamble is the key to unlocking the code of the Constitution, how social welfare, social emancipation is inbuilt into the concept of political liberty in India. Now, a libertarian who looks at the Constitution, any conservative judge, and most of our judges are, of course, conservative, any so-called meritorious casteless lawyer, all of these people will identify or adhere to the standard notion that first you have political liberty and then you have the possibility laid thereby for social justice. This can, in a million ways, just as Gandhi's claim that first let's have Swaraj and then we will deal with things like temple entry and eradication of fertility and whatnot. So there's always a sense of states, first political, then social. But the preamble was designed to do was to pack the social into the political as the conveyor making the political. So this is what Ambedkar tried to do in the preamble, but now we are presuming that Ambedkar wrote the preamble. Now, if we're all online, so if you have the possibility, you can just type it into right now, who wrote the preamble? You can just type in, who wrote the preamble to the Constitution of India? Who wrote the Indian preamble? Any search like that, and you'll see what answer comes up. Because I'm taking it for granted that Ambedkar wrote. So you can see the result that comes, unless the result relates to my book or any articles that I've written. You're going to see one answer.
Oh, no, it's all about Nehru and it's all about, other stuff. It's not about.
Exactly.
Yeah, very true.
You will not find in the top 20 sites that Dr. Ambedkar wrote the preamble to the Constitution. Now, it's, I said that I have no animosity towards Nehru at all. It's he's not a very relevant character in the story that I'm trying to tell. But one thing that we need to be clear about is that Nehru did not write the preamble to the Constitution. And any Google search in the year 2020, 70 years later, perpetuates false information, claiming that Nehru wrote the Constitution. You can check on Quora, you can check Wikipedia, you can check main Google search, you can check everywhere. This is only slowly starting to change this year because of my book, but before I wrote the book, every single website would come up with the immediate hit of Nehru. And then if not Nehru, if they were law forums, they would bow. That story of its own. And then if they were like NCRT textbook sort of, they would say drafting committee together. It was a collective. Now, all of these are wrong. Now, they are wrong, even though they are wrong, if you are a civil servant aspirant and you want to take this UC, you might be asked this very question, who wrote preamble to the Constitution? And I've checked on this answer sheet, and you have to write Nehru. In other words, if you actually know who wrote the preamble and you put the answer, you'll be marked wrong by the UPSC. So to become a bureaucrat in this government, you need to give the wrong answer about who wrote the preamble to the Constitution. I think that's shocking. Let's not worry about this. B.N. Rao, the constitutional, he did indeed a draft preamble along with the draft Constitution, but that was discarded. And then the idea that the drafting committee altogether wrote the preamble as a collective effort can be seen as somewhat absurd, because on the actual days that the preamble was introduced into the drafting committee on February 6, 48, there were only 3 members of the drafting committee present. So to say that the entire drafting committee wrote it is just factually absurd, because only 3 of the members were Dr. Ambedkar, of course, who never missed a single meeting, and 2 others. You can read about that drafting process, the days it was drafted in the book if you're interested. So what I want to come to is, we know that Dr. Ambedkar, author of the Constitution, and I'm sorry, of the preamble, I'm not talking about the Constitution as a whole, of the preamble. And what I want to home in on is that he was actually the sole author. For me to say that the preamble codes in that social justice is the condition for political liberty would mean that Dr. Ambedkar is the sole author, because this is a singular belief of Dr. Ambedkar. It's not a common or popular belief of the educated elite, and certainly members of higher classes or castes. So what we see then is that through the major concepts of the preamble, justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, dignity, and nation, we can trace back in these major concepts. These are the 6 main concepts of the descriptive part of the preamble. We can trace back who had an influence in introducing to these terms, introducing to these. And it is somewhat true that Google search results will tell you that Nehru, the preamble was supposed to be based on Nehru's objectives resolution. And indeed, words like justice, not liberty, but freedom and equality do occur in very similar ways in Nehru's objectives resolution as they do in Ambedkar. So to try to clarify or focus attention on is the way that a couple of the words, namely fraternity and dignity, have no salient appearance throughout the early 20th century in anyone's writings. Anyone who was a member of the Constituent Assembly, anyone who was a member of the drafting committee, except for Dr. Ambedkar, can do word searches in relationship to the Constitution, in relationship to major, look all through Bien Rao's writings, do a word search for fraternity, dignity. You can do the same search through all of Nehru's writings. You can do the same search through all of Gandhi's writings and so on. What you find when you do this search in Dr. Ambedkar's writings, find abundant and developing usage of these terms, fraternity and dignity, and you find them nowhere amongst the authors or contributors, drafters of the Constitution, and certainly not the. So what we find is that the ideas of the preamble are not only attributable to Dr. Ambedkar, but even the very terms used are exclusive to Dr. Ambedkar's larger body of writing and speeches. Now, what does this mean? This means that we need to understand the nature of these concepts like justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, in relationship, not necessarily to Nehru or Gandhi or other potential authors, but in relation to Dr. Ambedkar's writings themselves, the history of the development of the way Dr. Ambedkar's thoughts evolved, both through his speeches and through his publications, whether they be the Marathi journals or the English. And in tracing these concepts through those works, we evidence for what Dr. Ambedkar had in mind on February 6, 1948, when he single-handedly wrote down, I think in pen, I'm still working what happened on that very day. He wrote down and put in his shirt pocket what we know of as the Jan 1950 preamble, because it wasn't significantly changed after February 6, 1948 until the final version appears in 1950. And in those, we see that the notion of justice for Dr. Ambedkar, which is the first major concept of the principle, is a notion that means nothing other than liberty, equality, and fraternity, because Dr. Ambedkar stated this many times in his speeches, that justice is another word for liberty, equality, and fraternity. But what else he said that is quite significant, and he said it in his famous speech of the Mahad Satyagraha, said justice cannot be given to you as a gift, for example, from the state. It has to be struggled for. It has to be fought for, and it has to be wrestled from the state. Now, this is quite interesting. The assumption, for example, of 16 stormy days is that the state had done a nice job through the constitution of giving Indians justice, and then Nehru took it away through the First Amendment. But it's not really either Nehru or any executive's job to give justice to us as a gift. Justice is a gift. It is something that must be wrested from the state. And this is something that Dr. Ambedkar spoke about in 1927 and continued to speak of the 1940s when he was working in government. He toned it down a little bit, but it remains there. And then that he amplified again in the 1950s, especially 1951 to 1955, when he was working on an counter-revolution in ancient India. Liberty is another thing. I don't know if you're familiar with Marx's famous essay on the Jewish question, but there's often a distinction drawn between some kinds of liberty and real emancipation. And Dr. Ambedkar was very well in line with this notion that we don't want some abstract freedom. Freedom, as in plain bourgeois liberty, is hardly of any use to the destitute, is hardly of any use to people who have no real conditions to do anything with that freedom. So freedom, Dr. Ambedkar interpreted as emancipation. And emancipation is a concept that requires political liberty, but goes well beyond political liberty. And it goes beyond two distinct ways, differing from Marx, because towards the end of his life, Ambedkar wrote many attacks on the Marxist reductionism, the equation of all religion as being a kind of the masses, and made a distinction between Buddhism as an emancipatory religion. So differing from Marx, Ambedkar had two senses of emancipation. One is that could be achieved through religious experience, like conversion and agitation, collective agitation. And the other, social welfare for people who can achieve the material conditions to make something meaningful of their political liberty. So why I'm thinking this is that the Nehru's Objectives Resolution and the whole Swaraj movement, and you can see it in contemporary political philosophy all over the place, from Ananya Vajpayee's Righteous Republic to Gurpreet Mahajan's book on India recently, and so on. Everybody speaks about the 1950s as a moment of freedom, as spiritual awakening. But what this is a code word for a kind of Gandhian spiritualism, which we don't have really the mandate to get into today, but is it's a kind of code word for a sort of Sanskrit or Brahminical freedom, as opposed to an emancipatory, egalitarian freedom. So Ambedkar opted to change the word freedom in the preamble, liberty. The word liberty is free of the metaphysical ground of the notion of this Swarajist kingdom from the nationalist camp. So what we get are concepts such as justice, which Dr. Ambedkar introduces, such as liberty, which Dr. Ambedkar changes from freedom, and then the main concepts, equality, fraternity, and dignity, equality is there in all of the other versions of the preamble that came prior to Dr. Ambedkar's own new version. But the way to understand equality, it's a very simple expression, equality of status. The way to understand equality, and the only way to understand it, is by reading Dr. Ambedkar's masterpiece, Revolution, Counter-Revolution in Ancient India. What I think personally, I mean, not just personally, but as a scholar of history, one of the most important books of the 20th century, and a book that is only rivaled or don't rival to something like Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit or Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It is that monumental and powerful. What it argues is that the Constitution, the 1950 Constitution, is a revolution. And this is interesting because I don't want to say anything negative about our dear Anand Teltumde, who's suffering because of the brutality of a sinister conspiracy against him, and all my support for him. As a scholar, as an intellectual, I just want to point to his ideas, which is slightly problematic, that he thinks the radical in Ambedkar has been smothered and lessened through his cooperation with government in the late 1980s. I think Anand does not pay due to revolution and counter-revolution in ancient India, where we see that the Constitution is a revolution. And what kind of revolution is that? For this, you need to see in some ways Dr. Ambedkar's vast rewriting of Indian history to suggest that Buddhism appeared in ancient India as a revolutionary social force, not as a religion, but as a revolutionary social force. When Buddhism appeared, the basic principle of Buddhism was equality. And Ambedkar goes through a reading of the early suttas of the Pali canon, and picks out, shows the ways that these suttas are challenging fabric of Aryanism and later of Brahmanism, as opposed to the mere theological debates that it is presented as showing. But this emerging egalitarian, early egalitarian evolution of Buddhism in ancient India was overthrown counter-revolution. And that overthrowing happened in 3 ways. It happened in a political way, specifically by Pushyamitra Shunga, when he overthrew the Maurya dynasty. This started a political revolution. But that political revolution was stabilized in law through the Dharma Shastras, and specifically Manusmriti, that put Pushyamitra's new anti-Buddhist Brahmanism into a legal framework that had then to be disseminated and followed, and then ideologically stabilized through orthodox philosophy, Indian, especially Mimamsa and Vedanta, and the spread of these orthodox religious principles like the Puranas. So spread of counter-revolutionary, anti-egalitarian ideology initiated through one political revolution, legalized through the Manusmriti, and then disseminated as hegemonic through all of the vast literature of Hinduism. Now, this is the literature that we revere or are taught to revere today, from Mahabharata, Ramayana, and so on. And what that suggests for Dr. Ambedkar's rewriting of the history as a history of equality on the rise what that suggests is that we, especially Ambedkar's era in the 1940s, are immersed in a counter-revolutionary, anti-egalitarian ideology that the state perpetuates its administrative apparatus through its bureaucrats and through their control of our public education and textbooks, so that each of is essentially colonized, not colonized by the British, colonized by Brahminism. And this colonization of the mind, as we say, has got to be broken. And it has to be broken in precisely the same stages as the counter-revolution, that it must be broken politically. And Dr. Ambedkar says this political breaking happens with the emergence of the Indian Republic in 1950. The legal revolution or counter-revolution occurs through the Constitution, and specifically through the preamble's principle of equality. And then that remains the ideology. So what are we supposed to do about the ideology? How can we have a constitution that has affected a legal revolution and a polity, a democratic republic, that has affected a political revolution, and yet none of our egalitarian ideas from the state and the constitution and law are permeating society, because society is still under the hegemony of Brahminical, anti-egalitarian counter-revolution. This is why Dr. Ambedkar moves into Buddhism, because what Buddhism can do is this return to the egalitarian, early egalitarian appearance of Buddhism in India. This return to that ideology can supplant Brahminical Hinduism and its ideology. Wanted to write and celebrate and republish and so on. He wrote, he was involved with many republications of Buddhist texts, as well as Buddha and his Dhamma and so on. So what he was trying to spread kind of literature and philosophy of Buddhism in order to counteract the anti-egalitarian literature and philosophy that and caste based that we find in all of the mainstream literature that our social life, through Sanskritization and through the ideology of Brahminism, that they perpetuate in our young minds. So this is how the concept of equality, so equality is the basic foundation of Dr. Ambedkar's revolution, counter-revolution in ancient India. And when Dr. Ambedkar says equality in preamble, not talking about equality as it is stated in bland law. He's talking about equality as a revolution from his masterpiece book, Revolution and Counter-Revolution. And there's evidence for this that continues when we look then at the words that don't appear anywhere else. So yes, justice appeared many places, liberty many places, even though Ambedkar chose liberty and freedom from the original Objectives Resolution. And even equality appeared many places. But two words that never appeared anywhere are fraternity and dignity. Now, before I speak of fraternity, I just want to mention the way that the dignity clause preamble originally appeared on February 6th, because not in our history books. And I don't think even you might know. The original clause that Dr. Ambedkar had for the preamble states, so fraternity, so assure dignity irrespective of caste. Dignity irrespective of caste. Now, there's clear thumbprint, if you will, on this line. This is some great evidence, if any further evidence is needed, that Dr. Ambedkar single-handedly wrote the preamble. Now, to be fair, it was irrespective of caste and class, and then other people wanted other terms in there. And through the renegotiations of this clause in the drafting committee, we got the final version, dignity individual and nation. Now, nation itself was introduced not by Dr. Ambedkar. So the dignity of the individual, irrespective of caste. The leftists wanted class, and the right-leaning people wanted nation. And so in a compromise, we had caste, class, and nation. So that gave Ambedkar's interest, the concept of dignity irrespective of caste, in other words, the equal dignity of all castes. Now, as you probably know, Dr. Ambedkar's understanding of caste is that it's based on graded inequality, and what graded means is degraded, means increasing dignity and decreasing dignity. Now, dignity is an absolute concept, so you can't have less dignity, and if you degrade dignity, you have lost dignity. So consequently, when Dr. Ambedkar says dignity irrespective of caste, this is a phrase that is moving towards the annihilation of caste. Nevertheless, his interest was caste. The leftists' interest was class. He included that. The right nationalist interest, nation. So he included that. But in the process of bargaining, it became dignity of the individual and unity of the nation. That's a long story of its own, which I get into, but it's absolutely fascinating. You can read about it in the book. So why am I talking about dignity of caste? Because dignity is unique in Dr. Ambedkar's writings, and the fact that he attributes the clause to the concept of caste as an inherently degrading is further evidence that Dr. Ambedkar wrote the preamble. Now, dignity occurs within the fraternity clause of the preamble. So it's fraternity so as to ensure the dignity of the individual and the unity of the nation. Fraternity is one of the most fascinating concepts in the preamble because it is also the key that unlocks the relationship between the social in the preamble of the Constitution. Because fraternity is not a legal concept, it's a social concept. I had mentioned that the nature of political liberty in the preamble, according to Dr. Ambedkar's design, was that political liberty was coded with the prior notion of social emancipation. And fraternity is the precondition for social emancipation. When Dr. Ambedkar speaks of fraternity, he speaks about ideas that must be very familiar with, such as constitutional morality. Dr. Ambedkar spoke of constitutional morality is public conscience in the 30s and 40s, and then later he switches in the 50s to prefer to use Maitri or Metta. Now, the evolution of the concept of fraternity from this third phrase of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, to constitutional morality and public conscience, finally to Metta, is a further evolution of the notion of the relationship between the social and the political. A solution to what Dr. Ambedkar 3 times pointed out is the life of contradictions that we live because our Constitution inaugurates political liberty. Our society is already and long been ideologically subject to Brahminism, which is to say graded inequality, which is to say the refusal to acknowledge the dignity of certain castes and classes. So when Dr. Ambedkar introduces the idea of fraternity in preamble, here we find further evidence of his authorship throughout the Constituent Assembly debates. Dr. Ambedkar is singled out and thanked by members of the Constituent Assembly by name. I would like to thank Dr. Ambedkar for introducing the fraternity preamble. And this was done by even assembly members who did not like him and who were always arguing with him. So we have then evidence clear and building, not only of the authorship of Ambedkar of the preamble, which I think is completely beyond dispute from a historical perspective, even though Google searches and our UPSC and our government and our judiciary and so on have yet to realize this. But we also have knowing that Ambedkar was the author, we also now have to reread the meaning of the preamble. And when we understand the meaning of the preamble to fit along with Ambedkar's ideas of justice, his own idea of liberty, his own idea of equality, his own idea of fraternity, his own idea of dignity, and his own idea of nation, then we understand the true nature of the true nature of the preamble as the preface to a constitution that was not designed only to give liberty, but that was designed for large-scale civilization. Now, our judiciary, from the very first year, refused to recognize it. The very first constitutional amendment, as you know, deals not only with freedom of speech and so on, but also reservation because of Madras High Court's refusal to or claim that reservation was against the principle of equality from the Constitution. How can you read that reservation is against the principle of equality? Because you're reading the Constitution as a libertarian document that's providing only political liberty. But if you understand, intended it, that reservation was a promotion of equality, it's the relationship of equality to social revolution, Buddhism and counter revolution and so on, and because of its the way that reservation systematically dismantled Brahminism in our ideological institutions, for example, academia, university, school, and civil service. So if you understand what reservation allows to happen in terms of the egalitarian revolution to overturn the long-standing Brahminical counter-revolution against egalitarian Buddhism, then you see that we need reservation in order to produce enough critical mass that we can create new ideologies to free the colonization of our minds from Brahminism. The Madras Court and later Supreme Court had the idea that reservation was against the principle of equality because this is a purely libertarian reading of the Constitution. And in doing, they refused the state to not go into the original intent of the drafters, the framers of the Constitution. Now, intent is a very common way that constitutional courts or Supreme Courts read what a constitutional clause is supposed to mean. How could the Supreme Court of India go into legislative intent or original intent when they don't even know who wrote the document? So for all of these reasons, I think uncovering that Ambedkar was the author of the preamble and what he meant by the preamble and what the preamble should continue to us today in our continuous struggle to wrestle justice from an authoritarian state. We need to know that Ambedkar wrote it, why he wrote it, how he wrote it, and what it means. And once we can appreciate these elements, we can start to re-understand why it is that all of these other books are coming out about the Constitution, to, in some way, continue to struggle with trying to figure out, is this an emancipatory document or is it not? Is it something that we should cherish or should we not? What was in the mind of its drafters? And of course, this all focuses to Nehru and mistakenly not Ambedkar. But I hope in Ambedkar's in this book, of these questions, to address them, at least if I didn't answer them, and to allow the reader to see afresh, 70 years later, that as Dr. Ambedkar believed in 1950, his concerns somewhat later, we might discuss that. As Dr. Ambedkar believed, our Constitution is a revolution, and it is the revolution that provides the possibility of civil emancipation, which has for millennia been impossible in India because of the colonizations of our mind, if not by the the British and French and Portuguese and other colonizers, then by our own colonizers, and the ideology of inegalitarian Brahmanism. Okay, thank you very much. I hope I didn't go too long.
Akash brother, you have actually has taken us on a journey of the constitutional values which are so important for our country today, starting from justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, dignity, and nation. And I think despite of your poor connection, I think you could communicate a lot to our audience today about the importance of knowing why we should understand the constitution, how it was, how it came into being, and what we do about it. And one of the interesting thing that you brought up is how it's important for all of us to look at the preamblic values from the struggle of Baba Saheb Ambedkar himself. I think that was a wonderful enunciation. I have a few questions from the audience, and I will ask you those questions. A question is, if political liberty is what Dr. Ambedkar cherished, then how is it that individual liberty of thought found prevalence in the preamble? Please explain.
Can you repeat the if political liberty?
If political liberty is what Dr. Ambedkar cherished, then how is it that individual liberty of thought found prevalence in the preamble?
Okay, so political liberty is not as valuable as social emancipation if we have to put the freedom struggle in this context. So obviously, Ambedkar was a great fan of political liberty, but so was everybody else. So everybody, the entire nationalist movement was in favor of political liberty. What Dr. Ambedkar was in favor of is not using political liberty to sacrifice social emancipation. So social emancipation was more pronounced than political liberty. So that may have been a connection problem where the questioner has asked if political liberty. Now, the nature of the individual, the relationship to the individual and society is very complicated in Dr. Ambedkar's thinking. He is actually very philosophical. He has discussions of Kant and Hegel, the German philosophers, in this respect. Figure out how to balance the ideas of the individual and our social or corporate life. In the preamble, there's something very unique that happens. Dignity of the individual and unity of the nation. In other words, the individual comes prior to the nation. Now, there were several demands from the Constituent Assembly that the drafting committee must change this to unity of the nation and dignity of the individual. And when Dr. Ambedkar heard these requests, he got very upset. He got so upset that he wasn't even personally going to answer. He found in this an ally in B.N. Rao and even K.M. surprisingly. Each of the three had conversation, and they discussed how were they going to solve this problem of the nationalists asking for nation before individual. Dr. Ambedkar refused to relent on this. He said this basically: without the dignity of the individual, we will never have unity in this nation. And that is a prophetic statement, because what we are experiencing today is the greatest lack of more polarization than we've had in decades. And it's coming along with the increased recognition of the degradation of individuals in the country by the state and by society at large. So Ambedkar's position was that political liberty is necessary, but all of the nationalists believed in political liberty. They're needed to increase attention on social emancipation. And yet, if you compare the social with the individual, you must recognize that the individual precondition for the social, the precondition of the nation. So he had a complicated relationship between political liberty, social emancipation, individual dignity, and the nation. But this is unique in Dr. Ambedkar because I guarantee anyone else was heading the drafting committee and our constitution would have read unity of the nation and the dignity of the individual.
Right.
But he insisted that individual comes before nation.
Yeah. Akash bhai, a couple of questions. We have seen that Baba Saheb Ambedkar, along with liberty, equality, and fraternity, has used this word, beautiful word in Marathi called Manuski. And Eleanor has referred to this word. It's not just the three values together, but also the value of Manuski, which means humanness. It has meaning of dignity. So we can also trace that the dignity has a connotation which was with what we can say humanness, being human, and as a matter of fact have a dignified life. So I think we can trace that to Baba Saheb Ambedkar's thought on dignity as well. I have this question to you because you talked about these 6 important terms, and actually they are very dense terms, and we need to really analyze them, unpack the meaning, look into the writings and speeches of Baba Saheb Ambedkar to really grasp them. But this nation, the term nation, you have not spoken about today, and I think it has become when the concept of a nation is being contested, and there is so much happening around the ethnic nationalism, and on one hand, and there is something like civic and human nationalism. So can you please tell us when we talk about the concept of nation, and he has said that the fundamental duty of the state is to ensure that the citizens are free from want, free from hunger, and freedom from fear. So he links up the concept of nation itself with freedom from fear, freedom from hunger, so on and so forth. So can you please elaborate something on his concept of a nation vis-a-vis the 5 concepts that you have brought into play today?
Nation is unique because it is the one concept in the preamble that Dr. Ambedkar did not write himself. He agreed after the February 6th version of the preamble did not include the unity of the nation. Yeah. Now, Dr. Ambedkar is very strong on unity, as we know from the very first great speech he made in the Constituent Assembly, yeah. Calling for unity, as well as in the way he wanted to negotiate the union versus federation. So he didn't want a kind of federalism that would for the integrity of the central government, because he thought that the central government, not only for foreign policy, but internally would be strongly required for development and to ensure states did not get too parochial and continue to practice things like untouchability and so on. So Dr. Ambedkar was very strong on unity, but nation he was not too keen about. Now, there's a common concept, nation state, and Dr. Ambedkar believed that nation state was not a concept that applies to India. Given that castes are anti-national, and given that India is throughout its political boundaries and even beyond it in South Asia, is riddled with caste, it's impossible to say as a nation, because you have castes, and castes are their own kinds of nations. So if we do not have a nation state, what we have is a state that can become a nation. And the only way the state can become a nation is if we solve the antagonism between the political and the social, which is to say we harmonize political liberty with social egalitarian emancipation, social welfare and egalitarianism. And only then, when we practice, for example, at the administrative level, constitutional morality, and when we practice at the personal level, public conscience, that means I see someone being beaten, but he's not of my caste, so I don't care. This is how we find ourselves largely today. Instead, I see someone being beaten, hated, or degraded, or mistreated, irrespective of caste and gender and class. I get outraged in my heart, and I move to help. So until the point when that can happen, where I advocate that any caste member suffers, we cannot be a nation. So Dr. Ambedkar, the reason he didn't include nation in the original preamble was that he believed that what we are forming in this constitution is a state. Over time, if the state succeeds, it might become a nation. And this is why the state nation is used for Dr. Ambedkar's idea. What the nationalists believed is they have a nation. This is a nation, a long culture. They would slip into this kind of narrative. We have a nation that goes back to the Vedas, that goes back to our grand philosophies, yoga, the Upanishads, Vedanta. This is all of our grand nation. And now this nation gets a constitution, so it becomes a state. Ambedkar was dead against this, because in that grand narrative of nation, what happened to Muslims? What happened to Dalit Bahujan? What happened to Adivasis? What happened to women? Everyone is left out of this nation, except for male Hindu, upper caste. So Dr. Ambedkar said, your conception of nation, the popular conception of nation, is not our constitution. We are not constituting into a state that nation. We are constituting into a state, a disjointed, fractured set of smaller states and territories, which, if we can transcend caste, will one day become a nation. Right. So this was a big difference between Dr. Ambedkar and all of the other people in the Constituent Assembly. He did not believe in the nation state. He believed in writing a constitution to establish a state that could one day become a nation.
Akash Bhai, there is this question coming from audience who have been listening to you today. Your book mentions Dr. Ambedkar was more closer to economic justice. The question is like this: how did justice in Seriatim was followed by social first and then economic and after that political in the preamble?
So there is I think, a widespread mistaken belief Ambedkarites. I also believed it for some time, that this trinity of justice, that we use it in social justice, economic justice, that this trinity was Dr. Ambedkar's own. But it's actually a slogan from the Russian Revolution. And so what Dr. Ambedkar was doing, he was mixing the slogans of two revolutions in our preamble: the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, and the Russian Revolution, which uses these terms of social, economic, and political. Now, the Russian Revolution was itself incorporated by Nehru, the Objectives Resolution. So if you read the Objective Resolution, you see that Nehru had written, I can read the passage, I think I have, so this is Nehru's objectives resolution. We will create a constitution wherein shall be guaranteed and secured to all people of India justice, social, economic, political. So what Dr. Ambedkar has done is that he's taken this phrase from Nehru's objectives resolution, which was itself taken from the Russian Revolution. And so the order is not really Ambedkar's own design. He could have changed it because he also took freedom and changed it to liberty. He could have changed it. But my argument in the book is that that Ambedkar decided what to change based on how he could get support in the drafting committee for his own preamble. And so he wanted to fight certain, like putting individual before nation, but he did not want to fight other fights like the Justice Clause. In this way, he could get Nehru's support and Aladi Krishnaswamy Iyer on the drafting committee, his support for the preamble that Dr. Ambedkar newly introduces on his own.
Akash bhai, I think that was a wonderful presentation, and there is so much to even dig out from the actual history of the preamble, and you have done something very unique in terms of it's like a kind of Sherlock Holmes type of a work, approach of a sleuth, where you have gone into and also looking at the different meetings of the Constituent Assemblies, how many members were there, what they did, what conspired, where are the minutes of the meeting, and how Dr. Ambedkar might have pulled the preamble that he wrote himself from his pocket, and that was a final sort of a document, and it needed no further discussion because it was so succinct and so clear and so precise. I think that your book can be read as a political history, but interestingly, it is also like it's like a mysterious. It's a mystery book. Who done it?
Yeah.
It's a wonderful sort of a reading that I think everybody would enjoy, and I think a lot of young scholars are engaging with your book. I can see that, and we would like to invite you again to discuss further, maybe when you have a good internet connection.
Yeah, I'm so sorry about that.
No problem. We could manage to pull out the ideas, and I think it was like very helpful. We will see you soon, Akash bhai, and thank you so much for joining in, and we will keep interacting with you again and again.
Thank you so much, JB.
Jai Bhim.